This is you, my notes on it. It's cold this morning, it's not that bad. It's worse today. Lost my paper clips. Okay. So the next section we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the South. I don't know that I realize we only have 4 class periods left after this one. One next week and then the 3 the following week. So we may not get to the Civil War, but we're going to figure out why we fought it. And in order to do that, we've got to talk about the South. Because the South is very distinctive, and it is very different from the rest of the country in a lot of ways. And a big part of the distinctiveness of the South is that the South thought they were distinctive. They set themselves apart, or the people of the South anyway. But there were differences. Geography. It is warmer than most of the North. It's conducive to planting. There's a lot of geographical differences in the South. Excuse me. But overall, it is a very forgiving landscape. Unless you get too close to the coast and the malaria is kind of an issue. But there are mountains in the South, but not huge mountain ranges. There's nothing that you can't get around. It's fairly inviting geographically. There are enough differences. You have coastal areas, you have inland areas, you have old forest. So it's different from the North and the West and those ways. The biggest difference, obviously, is slavery, which, oddly enough, at the same time, it creates racial unity among the 2 main groups, which would be the African Americans and the whites. It also creates a biracial diversity. And it's an odd phenomenon, but the African Americans, even though they were enslaved, did heavily influence society in the South. And there's a certain familiarity. Whites in the South grew up with African Americans. That was not necessarily the case in the rest of the country. And the whole nation, the whole world at this point is very racist. It is a very, racism is rampant. I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying that is how it was. But there are areas of the country that the racial diversity is more along the line, it's not really racial, it's more ethnic. You know, you have Irish and Germans to hate, but they're basically white. You know, it's different. But in the South, you had the two just very distinctive different racial groups. You had African Americans and you had Anglos. And the racial unity is that both groups kind of hung together. You know, obviously, there's no intermarriage, or very little. There is not a lot of social interaction between the two groups. And the white Southerners used slavery, or didn't use it, it was kind of a byproduct of it, that to form kind of a closer bond. And this sounds very strange, but there's a lot of there was a caste system. You know, you had the very rich, you had the very poor, you had the people in the middle. But it didn't matter how poor you were, if you were white, you were at least better off than the African Americans. And that doesn't sound like a good excuse for racial unity, but it is. That is part of it. You know, I'm going to hang with this group because at least I'm better off than that group. The South also had the highest percentage of native-born Americans in both groups, both African Americans and Anglos. The South had not had a lot of immigration. There weren't hordes of Irish flowing through the ports in Galveston, or Germans coming in to set up independent farms. The South wasn't really welcoming to immigrants. They didn't need the Irish. Irish were basically laborers. They had a labor pool. They will use Irish and others for some of the more nasty tasks or the more dangerous tasks because slaves were more expensive. And you know, if you hire an Irishman to dig a ditch and the ditch caves in and he dies, you save some money because now you don't have to pay him. If you have your slave do it and the cave collapses and he dies, you've lost a monetary investment. It sounds kind of cruel, but that was the way it was. So you didn't have a lot of immigration, you had a lot of natural growth, and because of that, population kind of lagged behind the rest of the country. Religion, I've got like a couple of different things crossing, but we're going to go ahead and talk about religion. Religion in the South was also very unified. People were overwhelmingly Protestant, mostly Baptist and Methodist. Early on, both the Methodist and the Baptist disavowed slavery, but as time is passing, by the 1830s, both have given up on that and have started defending, both religions have started, at least in the South, defending slavery from the pulpit. And there are biblical passages that are conducive to that. You know, there's one where Jesus tells a slave, you know, go back to your master and be a good slave. But early on, the Baptists and the Methodists embraced African Americans and brought in women. But as the 1800s progress, they start shifting away from that. They do still allow African American members, but now the churches are more segregated, more divided. And religion in the South is going to start defending slavery rather than condemning it. And it's going to cause, and we'll talk about that in the next section because we're not quite to that point yet. It's going to cause some of these major religions to split. The Methodists are going to split, the Presbyterians are going to split, and these splits are going to last a very, very long time. The Presbyterians won't come back together until 1986. That's when they finally get over the Civil War. But you don't have a lot of the diversity that you have in the North. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't Catholics and that there weren't Jews, but there were not large pockets of them, and most of them were in the cities. And even within the South was not uniform completely. It kind of depended on where you were in the South as to how committed to slavery you were. The lower South, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas were very, very committed to slavery. These areas, slaves made up nearly half the population by the 1860s. These are the areas where cotton and tobacco, in South Carolina and Georgia, rice, in Louisiana, sugarcane. All of these crops are very labor intensive, and the labor came from slaves. They don't want to give that up. Southerners kind of dig themselves into a hole, basically. They marry themselves to this peculiar institution of slavery, and they can't really get out. And in a sense, they do this for the rest of the country as well. But we'll get there. The Middle South, which is Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, are more diversified agriculturally. There are whole areas without slavery, not so committed. Yeah, we want to keep our slaves, but maybe we're not willing to die for it. Maybe we could see a way around it. The Upper South, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, states that a lot of people don't even consider Southern. But they are Southern states. Slavery is on the decline. Things are changing in those areas, and slavery is really on its way out. They are the least committed to slavery. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to be willing to support it. And all of this is economic. And the economy in the South rests on agriculture. The geography lends itself to that. And the profits that they are making are good enough that, I mean, they're very good, that there's no incentive to diversify. So you've got tobacco still in Maryland, Kentucky, Virginia, Missouri. Some people are still growing indigo, but indigo the appeal of indigo vanishes when the British quit paying bounties on it. More people nation or worldwide are growing it. So indigo kind of goes by the wayside. Rice, that's very limited. It's the tidewater areas of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Rice requires that the fields could be flooded. It takes a lot of mechanical intervention as well as human labor. And so you only have a few very, very large plantations that are growing rice. But these few have an overwhelming amount of influence. Sugar creates the southern anomaly. Louisiana is where all the sugar's grown. You've got sugarcane plantations there. Sugarcane is another one that's very labor intensive. Sugarcane's kind of fun. Not if you have to work it, but if you can go like as a kid and see a sugarcane plantation and get like a stick of sugarcane. It looks like bamboo. And you have to cut it, you have to crush it. But sugar has to have a tariff to protect it. Sugar can be brought in from lots of different places. So American sugar, in order to survive, or the people selling it, they needed a high tariff. So that's the one area of the South that you're going to get congressmen and senators pushing for a high tariff. The rest of the South, they all want a low tariff because they want to be able to buy cheaper imported goods. Cotton is the last crop brought in, but is going to way outpace all the other crops. In 1812, there were around 150,000 bales of cotton produced a year. So in 1812, there were 150,000 bales of cotton. By 1860, the South is producing 4 million bales a year. That's a lot of cotton. That's a lot of exports. And 90% of it, 80 to 90% of it, is going to the French and the British to feed their mills. Cotton is also, as I know I've mentioned before, very hard on the soil. And so people keep pushing west to get new, better farms. Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, they're all seeing these farmers come in. That being said, there was other things being grown in the South. The South fed itself. Corn, wheat, potatoes, cattle, hogs. All of these things were being grown in the South and put food on the table. So the South wasn't, completely married to the staple crops, but that's what the economy is married to. And a lot of people overlook the fact that they also fed themselves from these fields. Manufacturing and trade, not a big deal in the South. Scientific agriculture was starting to be accepted as people realized they were using up the soil. They needed to learn about crop rotation, planting other things to reinvigorate the soil. And in the 1840s, there was a push for manufacturing plants. Part of the argument against this was that slaves would not be good in factories. Of course, that's not true. The factories that the South did have were in a large part staffed with slaves, and they worked just fine. There was the Tredegar Iron Works. That was a huge, they made cannons. The big problem with manufacturing in the South is it didn't make as much money as growing cotton did. And why invest in something if the return is not going to be as, if you have a choice, I'm going to invest either in a mill that makes fabric, and say the returns, I'm making up numbers, are $1,000 a month. Or I can take that same money, invest it in a new section of land, and my returns are going to be $5,000 a month. I'm not going to open a mill just because the South needs mills. I'm going to plant some more cotton. I'm going to happily ship that stuff out. I don't care that the South is basically indebting itself to the North, because the shipments go through northern vessels. They're going to foreign countries and to the North. I'm making money. And that's basically what it comes down to. There was no reason for the people who had the money. They've already had their investment in what is bringing in the most money. But they tie themselves to this. And in a sense, they tie the North and the British and the French and everybody else who's buying cotton, because cotton can't be grown without slaves at this point in time. But it creates in the South a difference, a distinctiveness. We're a sea of, the South is a sea of agriculture in an ever more urbanizing, mechanizing world. The rest of the country is becoming more urban, becoming more industrialized, but not in the South. And Southern society is going to rest on the two groups that are there. You've got the white society, and then you've got the African American society. The planters, they are at the top of the heap, even though there is only a small percent of the population can be classed as a planter. To be classed as a planter, you have to have more than 20 slaves, and your operation has to use the labor force under a separate control to grow profits. You have to have, it has to be more commercial than just the family farm. But these few people are going to set the tone for the economic and social life in the South. Really, only about 1 out of every 30 farm owners was a planter. I've got numbers here, but numbers really don't. About 1/4 of the population, men, women, and children, had a hand in the plantation system, owning it. Fewer than 11,000 held 50 or more slaves. There were only 2,300 that held over 100. There were only 11. And this is about 1860. Sorry. 11 had over 500, and there was only 1 in the census reports that had over 1,000 slaves. So basically, less than 15,000 people are going to control the social and economic life of the South. Now, in some of the frontier regions where you really didn't have a lot of planters at all, you still had more farms. Those farm owners became the substitute for that. And really the difference between a farm and a plantation is how they use their slaves. On a farm, the farmer and his wife and his children are all going to work together with the slaves. Everybody's going to be out in the fields. You just don't have enough hands. By the time you have a plantation, you can separate that out. And the plantation house is run by the plantation mistress, the wife, the mistress. They also had mistresses, but we'll get to that in a minute. Where on a farm, everybody kind of works together. So about 4% of the population held more than half the slaves and produced most of the cotton, tobacco, hemp, and all of the rice and sugar. Not only do they control the crops, in a lot of areas, particularly the tidewater areas, they control the wharves. So if you have a crop and you need to get it to market, you have to bring it through their plantation to get it out to sea. They hold the mills. They held the cotton gins. So they were, the plantation owners would be, or held some power over the smaller farmers who needed their services in order to get their product to market. So that's the planter. The plantation mistress was the one who managed the household, the wife. They had to, it's really deal with a lot. It was not like a farm wife who got up every morning and made food, but she had servants, sometimes slaves, sometimes not. Most times they were, that she had to manage and make sure that, you know, the household work was done, the food was done, the gardening was done, food procurement was managed, and they also had to deal with some of the uglier sides of the slavery. Let me see if I can find the quote really quick, because I didn't write it down. Mary Chestnut, who was the wife of a planter, wrote in her diary, ours is a monstrous system. Like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their enslaved concubines, and the mulattoes one sees in every family partly resemble the white children. Any lady is ready to tell you who is the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household but her own. Those, she seems to think, drop from the clouds. So the men pretty much had free run. There was no law. There were laws against raping white women. There were no laws against raping slaves. And children were born out of this. One lady will write in her diary about her husband and others, how monstrous they are because they give birth to these children and then sell them because they're mulatto children, but they don't claim them as their child. And it is a horrible system. And that is one of the things that the plantation mistress had to deal with. Being a slave was bad. Being a slave and being a woman was even worse. And we're going to get to the black society in a minute. But being a white woman in the South also had its disadvantages. But it also had its advantages. The plantation mistress was the head of society. She had a lot of power, just not over her husband usually. The middle class of the white were the overseers. The overseers were the ones who ran the gangs of slaves on the farm. They were the ones who actually did the directing, the work, or they didn't do the work, but they saw that the work got done. There were a few black overseers. Mostly the highest that a black man could aspire to as a slave was to be a driver. And a driver was like a step down from the overseer. He was in charge of a group, but not all the groups. The most numerous group of the middle class were the Southern Yeoman farmers. Those are the farmers I've been talking about. Some owned slaves, some did not. The ones that did usually worked with them. They were a very mobile group. They were always willing to uproot, move west, move south, wherever the next best patch of cotton was. Because the way the South was colonized, all the good land went to the people who had lots of money. That's just how it works. So a lot of these middle class farmers are kind of working around these huge plantations. If you have enough land, you can actually rotate the crops and kind of save your land. If you only have 80 acres and a mule, you got to plant your 80 acres. And when that 80 acres is spent, you got to move on. And these farmers were more than willing to do that. They're an independent group. They're a little suspicious of government. Most Southerners were supporters of Jefferson, and the idea of a small agrarian country, limited government, and most supported the peculiar institution, in part because it held their position in society, and in part because they feared that if blacks were freed, they would compete with them for the land, which is a legitimate fear. The last group, and I only mentioned it because I mentioned it in the book, are the poor whites, not as kindly called white trash. They were more of a degraded class, and this is not what we would call white trash today. These people were really down on their luck. They were pushed to like the worst lands. You would find them like along the edges of forests, in the swamplands, in the sand lands where nothing would really grow. Popular culture at the time held that they were the descendants of the indentured servants and the convicts that were brought over by the British. Probably not. But most of them did suffer from diseases that you find in these areas. Hookworm, malaria, diseases that the book classes as lazy diseases. They create in the person who is suffering from them lethargy, which, from the outside appears you're lazy. No, you're freaking exhausted and you can't work. And not only can you not work, you can't work the land that's not going to produce anything because you're living on the edge of a swamp. As medicine improves, this kind of group kind of goes away. On the other hand, the white trash group does not. They're still with us. The biggest part of Southern society is this idea of honor. And this is true of all of the Anglo, of the whites in the South. The South has an overinflated idea of honor. And honor was to be guarded at all costs. Be that the honor of a woman, be that the honor of your word, whatever it is, honor is above all. They buy into this cavalier idea, kind of a Camelot idea of, knights in shining armor, very proper, very good manners. All of these things are important to Southerners. And if threatened, they tended to react very violently. A duel was a common response for, what we would see as a very minor slight. Um, you know, I question your word on something, so then I have to fight you in a duel. They tend to go this way, and a lot of this or part of this is heritage. You have a lot of the early settlers not only were British but Scots, Welsh, so you have some German background in there. You get some of this stubborn, some of that violence from those groups. But keep in mind that they have this idea of knights in shining armor and chivalry and honor. Honor is important above all else, and you can't threaten that. The other side of society was Black society, and this is the fastest growing group in the entire United States. In 1790, there were fewer than 700,000 Blacks in the United States. By 1830, so 40 years, there's more than 2 million. By 1860, that doubles to about 4 million. Most are enslaved, not all, and there is a growing group of free Blacks, both in the North and the South. But as the century progresses, as we work through the 30s and 40s and into the 50s, free Blacks are going to see a lot of their rights curtailed. By 1860, the dollar value of all Southern slaves was more than all banks, railroads, and factories combined. That's to give you an idea of how much the economy in the South banked on that. I mean, you could liquidate all the banks, all the railroads, and all the factories, and you still couldn't buy out all the slaves. There's a huge amount of money tied up in slavery. And yes, human lives are worth more than money, but even today, money talks. And we're talking about a time when racism was accepted pretty much everywhere. A lot of countries, Britain has outlawed slavery, Spain has outlawed slavery. That doesn't mean if you were a Black man, you could walk into Madrid and be a happy camper. Or in London, racism is still rampant. Just to give you an idea of what we're going to. So, free Blacks, free persons of color, and that also includes mulattoes. And if you don't know, a mulatto is somebody of mixed heritage, somebody who has a white mother and a Black father, or white father and a Black mother, or some, a white grandmother. So they were born of a mulatto and a Black, or a mulatto and a white. They make up about 10% of this free Black population, but they're still considered colored or Black, depending on how you want to word it. And they're free, but not entirely. They held this kind of uncertain stature in society. Many were very, very well off. Like the biggest hotel both in New Orleans and Charleston were both run by mulatto men. And they catered to the white planters that came in. There were free Blacks that held slaves In the 1830 census, 3,775 free blacks held 12,760 slaves, which is really only 2% of the slave population, in slavery. Some of them did it because they were just as bad as the white planters or white farmers. Some of them were ministers or other well-meaning people who were buying slaves and then either giving them their freedom outright or allowing them to work for them until they had earned enough money to pay off what, say, the owner had paid for them. Others are family members who are buying up, like you might have like a free black man who buys his wife and his children. And then, but for whatever reason doesn't actually give them their freedom. So on the books, they still look like they're slaves. So you have this one group of free black people. But most of black society are slaves. Slavery has been, the slave trade, outside slave trade, has ended in 1808, but inside the country you still have a slave trade. Because slaves are so valuable, they actually are starting to see better treatment. Still not good treatment, you're still a slave, but better. Like I said, a lot of times they would bring in the Irish or some other immigrant or pick up one of those poor whites off the edge of the swamp and hire them to do the really dangerous work. But they're still a slave. Louisiana and Alabama in 1852 actually passed laws that forbid separating a child from under 10 from their mother. Before that, and in all the other states, there's no laws. So you could trade a slave anywhere, any way you wanted. Plantation slavery was the bulk of the slaves. Not all the slaves on a plantation worked in a field. Preferred jobs were household worker or skilled servant. Those got you a little bit better off. And sometimes, particularly, and I don't know if I have it down here, particularly the slaves that lived in the cities, and there were slaves that lived in the cities or close to cities. If you had a skill, like you were a welder or a blacksmith, they could be loaned out and actually make some money of their own. So you know, I'll loan you my blacksmith, you're going to pay him $10 a week, but I get 2 of that. But he gets to keep some. And that was one way that you could earn enough money to buy yourself out of slavery. Custom held that most slaves got 2 sets of clothes a year, 1 set of shoes. It was hard on a slave. The infant mortality rate was twice that of whites. About 50% of slave children born died in their first year, compared to about 25% of white children, which is still pretty bad. You know, you have a 1 in 4 chance of living through your first year. Infant mortality overall was, you had about a 50-50 chance of making it to your 5th birthday. Once you got there, you were much better off. And of course, slaves escaped. About 50,000 slaves a year escaped. But running had its dangers too. Because if you're caught, you're going to be returned, and you're not going to be returned in the same good shape you left in. Somebody's going to beat you before you get back. Like I said, being a woman and a slave was even more difficult. There is a very moving account in your book. I'm going to let y'all read that about Celia. But, women, because women are the ones who have children, and that is now how your slave population is going to grow, is through natural increase. And that increase could be because of the plantation owner. It could be because of another slave. It could be consensual or not. A lot of slave women use their skills to woo their master away from his wife. And it happened. But it was more difficult. And during your childbearing years, not only were you having to work and have children, they did give you a little bit of a break. But once you got past those to your menopausal years, then you were really forced out into the fields. And it wasn't until a woman was considered elderly that she would be brought back in and basically put in charge of daycare for everybody else. There were slave rebellions. Slave rebellions were very difficult. It's hard to pull something like that off when you're being watched all the time. There were 3 major slave rebellions that actually went somewhere. In 1800, a man named Gabriel plotted to seize key points in Richmond and planned a general slaughter of all whites. But it rained the day that he was supposed to pull this off, and a lot of his cohorts couldn't make it to the assigned meeting place. And word came out as to what he was doing. He is executed. 25 others were executed. 10 were sent to the West Indies. And if you were a slave in the United States, that was bad. If you were a slave in the West Indies, that was worse. So that was the big threat. In 1822, Denmark Vesey leads a revolt in Charleston, plans to seize ships, burn the city, and head for Santo Domingo. Again, he's found out before it starts. 35 are executed, 34 are deported. And this is the first one that really causes the free blacks some suffering, because they curtailed the liberties of free blacks after that within Charleston. The big one that caught everybody's attention was the Nat Turner Revolt in 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia. He was a black overseer. He was a minister. He was well liked by both his owner and the blacks on the plantation. He kills all of the people, the adults and children in the master's household, including the baby, and sets off down the road repeating. Before he's done, they've killed 55 whites. I can't remember how many households, probably like 10, on their way to the city. The militia come in. They obviously are going to overreact, because that's what militias do, and kill many more slaves than were actually involved. They finally catch Nat Turner. They kill him. 75 are hanged. A bunch of them are beheaded, and their heads are put on stakes along the roads as reminders to other people not to do this. But when you consider there are only 3 major rebellions, not a lot of people tried it. It was very dangerous. But the fact that they did some caused an inordinate amount of fear among the white population of the slave rebellion. Most rebellions were simple things like, I'm tired of hoeing this patch of cotton and I break the hoe. Yeah, I might get beat, but I get the afternoon off until they can find another hoe or fix this one. And sabotage was the main form of rebellion. But sabotage also has a problem. you want, your plantation has to be making some money in order for them to feed everybody. So you can't go too far with sabotage. Okay, we will finish this part on Monday. Y'all have a great weekend. If you have anything to turn in, put it up here on the corner. No, I completely forgot. Don't worry about it. Okay. I'll just count everybody here today.